We're going to start with Dominic. So Dominic has been instrumental in leading the agenda in driving up quality standards around exempt accommodation in the city. So it'd be really good to hear from Dom his views, really just around how quality exempt accommodation can contribute to the agenda that we've been hearing about.
Okay, thank you. It's worth mentioning just before we start as well the relief that I've got that I'm sitting on this Westlife stool, because I was chatting to Helen outside and she goes, "Have you seen the stage on there? We're going to have to climb up on the stage." And I thought, by the time my trousers are too tight for this, by the time I get up on the stage, I'll be arrested. So I'm really relieved we are where we are. Just a few comments generally before I get on to the quality standards work that we've been doing. I think fundamentally agree with everything that John said, but so much of the government interventions at the moment is focused on crisis. We have to do more around prevention, and that all comes in to do with supply and housing supply. We've almost bastardised the term affordable housing. We need more social rented homes, which is the lowest form. We've got 2,400 people in temporary accommodation. Why can't we move them on? Because there's no suitable housing. And often we talk in support very specifically about the complexity of the cases that we're dealing with, and there's no doubt with all the cuts to preventative services that is the case. But what we don't often talk about as support providers are the people that access supported accommodation, exempt accommodation, that actually don't need it. They just need a roof over their head, and there's a whole different gambit and conversation that we probably need to have about that. And so there was probably some examples that we even saw in the film earlier. Just on the Birmingham specific thing, we've been doing quality standards work in partnership with BVSC. The city have been really good in leading this piece of work. We have quite a specific problem in Birmingham in that we have a huge amount of supply of exempt accommodation that isn't necessarily strategically aligned to the priorities of the city. If we just give a quick example, we've got, I think it's still over 500 single people that are in temporary accommodation, yet we've got a big, huge amount of exempt accommodation within the city. And we often talk that actually the regulations around exempt accommodation is pretty loose, because we have to go back to the housing benefit regs in 1996 when they were formed. Things have moved on, and we've got these umbrella style housing providers that didn't even exist back then. So there's new challenges that are presented. What is clear is that there's an absolute need for them, and what is there in that sector is innovation as well. So it's trying to capture that, but making sure that actually the standards are there. Because you even get into the stage where people actually don't even need a DBS to work in with very vulnerable people. So that's clearly a challenge that's been recognised by a number of partners. So we began the work to work with, and specifically about the non-commissioned providers that are working within the city. Just to give you a picture, I think there's 12,400 units of exempt accommodation in the city. Just over 1,000 of those are commissioned by the city. So there's a big gap in non-commissioned providers. So part of our work is to work in partnership. We're one of those that are non-commissioned. So we talk with not authority, but we understand the issues on both sides of the fence. So that's the challenge that we've begun in partnership with the city, John.
Great, thank you. And so I've left my microphone behind because it was squealing. I think there was something really important that was said there. You know, let's not get hung up on this is all about supported housing. Most people just need a roof over their head and a sustainable income to be able to afford it. But if they do need the rest, then the comments on quality really important. We're going to turn to health now, and I know that health are willing partners here. And I spend so much of my time sitting in rooms with people saying, well, if only we could get health involved. If only we get health involved. So here, health is involved. So can we just talk a little bit about how we ensure that the willingness of health actually comes to fruition here, and how that works here? Yeah.
We can. Hello everybody, my name is Bernadette Byrne, and I work for the Birmingham Solihull Mental Health Foundation Trust, and have the great privilege of being responsible for the management of the homeless community mental health team in Birmingham. But also, and unusually, we also as a mental health trust run what's called the Birmingham Homeless Health Exchange, which is a GP practice for people who are homeless in Birmingham, and those people who are rough sleeping, and those people that are in temporary accommodation. And we took over that contract about 10 years ago because nobody else was interested in it in Birmingham. No other GP practice, no other commissioner. So we thought, well, let's give it a go. And we started off with 500 people registered with the Health Exchange, and people that come to the Health Exchange are homeless. What we try to do is help them with all of their health problems. We have a group of staff who are just frankly amazing in terms of practice nurses, GPs, mental health nurses and substance misuse specialist advisors at the Health Exchange. And our numbers have increased in the last 10 years by over 100%. So our practice list size now is over 1,000 people in Birmingham and Birmingham alone, predominantly around the city centre of Birmingham, but with a few outliers. And we keep people on our lists in Birmingham until we have them in more permanent accommodation or permanent accommodation, and they stay with us until then. And the two teams that I look after interlink with each other. So if someone has a serious mental illness and they have nowhere to live and they're registered to the Health Exchange, they can also link into our local mental health service. We link into local substance misuse services, and we also link into the acute hospitals where we see lots of people from the street being admitted, sometimes through the Health Exchange, often from the street, and then we pick them up as they're being discharged out of hospital, quite often still homeless, still on the street, with a variety of medication and sometimes attached to various equipment. And they come to see us at the Health Exchange, and we work out how we're going to support those people. It's a service that's been under threat recently. We had a very poor CQC rating because the CQC just didn't understand how a GP practice for homeless people worked, the fact that there's no point just having booked appointments that people don't turn up for. So we try and be as flexible as we can be, and that comes with a challenge and a risk. But we decided, well, do you know what? If we're inadequate, we're inadequate. We're going to move forward and try and make that better. We've just been reassessed, and we still need improvement, but we are good, a CQC good rating for care and being responsiveness to people that live on the street. And I think the team at the Health Exchange and in the community mental health team are really proud of that rating. And we've also just been given some more funding, because we've had no funding for that service for the last 10 years over than what we got when we originally started. So we are seeing progress. We are definitely here to support homeless people and the homeless agenda of Birmingham. And we keep fighting for additional resources and doing things differently. So I think that's probably it for now, but we're here and happy to help.
So we talked about courage and taking some risks. I think we just heard about courage and taking some risks there. And I think, really it's a precious thing that you've actually got health engaged in this in this city, because, we all know the links between physical mental health and what it's like on the streets. And we all know that health can be one of the biggest forces for preventing homelessness. So let's keep developing that. Let's keep developing that service. Thank you so much. We're going to just turn to some issues of attitudes and early intervention. We heard both in the film and in Carol's presentation about the link to domestic abuse. And suddenly anyone who's got any lazy stereotypes about homelessness suddenly has them challenged. So I was wondering, Helen, if we can talk about what it's going to take to get really behind some changing attitudes in the city.
Okay. Hi, my name's Helen and I'm from Trident. We deliver alongside our homeless services and young people services provision of support for people experiencing domestic abuse. And I think what we've heard, going back to the film that we saw, some of the content of Cal's presentation, is that domestic abuse is, linked to homelessness, and the sister strategy to the homeless prevention strategy is the domestic abuse one, which focuses on changing attitudes, early intervention, and a crisis response to people that are experiencing or being impacted by domestic abuse. How do we as a city get behind that? How do we start to change those attitudes? That can take place in a number of areas across the city, both in communities, in social settings, in organisations, faith-based settings, educational settings. So it's an area that everybody can have an input into. How do we change those attitudes? Organisationally, you know, we're all here. We all are linked to an organisation. We all are employed by, or we all lead organisations. Ask ourselves, you know, how are we responding to domestic abuse? What's our organisational response to domestic abuse? 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men will be impacted by domestic abuse. So within this room there will be people that have experienced or know somebody that's experienced. Within organisations there'll be people that are experiencing it and also potentially being perpetrators. So what do we do about that? Do staff know what their organisational response is? It's about raising public awareness, public perception, challenging those social norms that people come to accept within communities. Early intervention with schools, young people, children, living with domestic abuse, growing up in an environment of domestic abuse can have long-lasting impacts. So education, what are healthy relationships, what do they look and feel like, what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, so that those young people as they move towards adulthood understand what's right, what's acceptable and what isn't. How do we support young people that potentially could become victims, but equally so could become perpetrators? You know, so how do we work with young people individually in group settings to address some of those issues and make that change in behaviour? Give people safe spaces to be able to disclose when they're concerned either about themselves or other people. Again, sort of early intervention, prevention, changing attitudes. If we can get that part of the pathway right, it then sort of helps with the crisis response. We can look to reduce the impact of people having to present in a crisis situation. Running throughout all of the themes is about keeping people safe, giving people safe options, education, awareness, keeping it on the agenda. Don't feel uncomfortable having the conversation. It's everybody's business. It's not acceptable, and the only way that we can start to change that attitude is to talk about it more and have those challenging conversations.
Thank you. I have to say, given that we didn't know what the question was, that was you know, just an amazing walk through some of the systemic issues that we're dealing with here. And I think, you know, there's a key thing in all of this is that when we did some work on public attitudes to homelessness, we found, you know, neither the public nor the so-called experts saying anything which was particularly helpful. So a public feeling that it's all about an individual who had a bit of bad luck, or maybe it's them to blame, when actually it's about how we respond to situations like that. And then you had us lot in the homelessness sector guilty of trotting out lazy imagery of middle-aged men rough sleeping because it's easy for fundraising, and perpetuating some of those images as well. So, you know, really important that we follow that advice, work together, and actually look at the reality of the situation, which is people really building pressure in their lives, tipping over the edge, and a system which isn't there to support them when it needs to be. Let's go right to the very front line of preventing homelessness. And you know, again, some lazy thinkers in the sector I represent often see the police in the wrong light. You know, the police are the front line in tackling homelessness, preventing homelessness, dealing with it. When they do it well, they can make such a massive, massive difference. So maybe if we just talk about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that come from a police perspective when it comes to tackling homelessness.
Thank you. So my name's Sarah Tambling. I'm an acting superintendent at Birmingham West Neighbourhood Policing Unit. So that means that I've got responsibility for all the local policing teams for half of Birmingham, basically, everywhere from Perry Barrow all the way down to Longbridge, and it includes the city centre here in Birmingham. I also hold a role for the force as developing towards becoming a subject matter expert for homelessness. I wouldn't say I'm one already, I've still got a long way to go, but it's because it's something I'm really passionate about. It's something that I'm learning and developing partnerships across the whole of West Midlands in relation to. And so I answer this question really from two directions. One, as that SME role, is to gather information about how our policing teams across the West Midlands are tackling homelessness, bringing together examples of best practice, learning from colleagues across the partnerships as to where things are working well and where we potentially can do more, and bringing that into my own local policing teams also here in Birmingham, in the city centre in particular. I feel responsible for making sure that our frontline policing teams have got the education that they need to upskill, to learn more about homelessness, to learn more about the tools and the opportunities that they've got to tackle it and prevent it in the first place. So, you know, big shoes to follow from my predecessors in this role, but I hope to develop it further. I'll perhaps just reflect on the role that our city centre teams do here in Birmingham, and you heard from Inspector Soraya Latif, who spoke on the video that we saw earlier on the film about the work that her teams do. And that's where I think we do see some really good practice from the police in preventing homelessness, where our teams work in partnership on a daily basis with partner agencies across the city centre and across Birmingham to engage with the homeless community and prevent them from being homeless, to educate them and support them through that time. I think our teams in the city centre in particular also have responsibility around preventing other aspects of crime, enforcing against drug dealers, enforcing against antisocial behaviour and exploitation that puts our homeless community even further at risk. And I see the examples of that on a daily basis, and we really do target those areas of antisocial behaviour that will put that community at risk in the city centre and across the areas of Birmingham. I think really to reflect on the challenges that we face, it's no secret that policing has faced significant amount of challenges in recent years. In times of austerity, our numbers of resources are dwindling fast. You don't see as much visible policing in recent times as you perhaps have done in previously, and that's because as crime changes, it goes into the online community a lot more. We have far greater levels of cybercrime than we've perhaps ever seen or understood, which means that resources that work in the background aren't that visible face of policing. Yet we still maintain some visibility in those local policing teams, but they're expected to tackle so much. Everything from homelessness that we're talking about today, but through to robbery, to burglary, to exploitation, to theft, to any sort of crimes behind the scenes. Domestic abuse has been spoken about as well. So we really do find ourselves having to prioritise. And so for us as a city centre to continue to invest in homelessness and preventing it in the first place, I think is a really strong position to be in, and we pledge to continue to support that. I think going forward there's more that we can do. I feel that we've got more to do in the Housing First arena. So I think some of my frontline resources are well educated on what Housing First means and how we can support that, but not all of them are. So we need to get that upskilled and really quickly. I think we've got a lot to do in the criminal justice arena as well, and tend to work with colleagues across the force and in particular in Birmingham around how we offend manage and refer in people who are leaving prison, how we reflect on our actions at the scene of domestic abuse incidents that could, potentially we don't often see, I don't think, how we could be actually causing homelessness in some circumstances, certainly when people leave our custody environments. And I think we as an organisation could be more reflective around that. And so for that, pledge to work with colleagues across the force to improve our perceptions around that as well, and to improve our practices, and continue to educate and support colleagues going forward, really. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Cal, we've heard quite a lot from you, but I'm looking across here and seeing like some amazing partnership potential and partnership working. I just thought maybe just some comments from you on how you're going to use that, capitalise on that, because there's a real spirit of cooperation there. So maybe a couple of comments on that.
Yeah.
Then we'll take a couple of questions from the audience, and then we'll ask Councillor Thompson to talk about what's coming in the next in the second year of the strategy, and then we'll just about make it over the line for 12 o'clock, I think. So a couple of comments on that.
So just briefly then, so a lot of my colleagues sitting here are partners on the Homelessness Partnership Board, and as I said at the beginning of my presentations, year one was about getting going and building the momentum up. What we want to do is move into some more detailed conversations with individual organisations and really challenge ourselves and ask ourselves the question, what difference is that action making towards delivering the vision that we have for our citizens who are at risk of homelessness or are homeless? And then asking ourselves the question, how does that then shape a response for year two? So that you know, it is that thing about, you know, we've got great partnerships in the city and for which we are very, very grateful. You know, Birmingham is built upon fantastic partnerships, but let's use those partnerships to have very challenging conversations with each other, because our citizens deserve that. You know, and I think out of that will come further commitment and further innovation as well. So I'm sorry if that sounds a little bit vague, but there is something about just building upon what we've started.
Doesn't sound vague at all to me. Right, anyone have any questions for anyone on our esteemed panel? Surely not.
I've got one.
Yes, good.
So
Let me give you a
sure.
microphone. Do a bit of multitasking. I'll be the roving mic as well. There we go.
Mick Gallagher from Prospect Housing. Recently just arrived back in Birmingham after working around the country for quite a while. Really, one of the issues for me, I think Dominic certainly touched on it, I think many other individuals also, is about, you know, yes, all of the support going into individuals, but actually there is still the issue about the supply of accommodation and the availability of accommodation. So one for me was about, what's kind of astonished me, I think, over the last 3 or 4 years is the number of empty homes that we actually have in this country, and I think particularly in the capital, I think it's just quite outstanding. You know, it's just unbelievable. So are we actually doing any work behind the scenes? We've already mentioned, you know, one of the programmes that happened earlier on, but is there more going on behind the scenes to actually bring some empty homes back into use? And I think, sadly, the other thing that I've seen, not with every RP by any stretch of the imagination, but the eligibility and allocations criteria to access housing is, quite frankly, just putting barriers up to individuals actually getting access into that secure, longer-term permanent accommodation.
We don't all have to answer, but who wants to have a go at that?
John, I'll answer it.
Ah, here we go. Here we go.
Thank you. And apologies that I've missed so much. Just in terms of that question, I think it is a very relevant question. I think huge issues across the cities in terms of supply and demand. The council is currently doing a lot when it comes to looking at supply, and particularly around empty properties. So we reviewed the empty property strategy and we've put a number of things in place at the moment. So the strategy that's in place at the moment anticipates to help us to bring back another 350 empty properties per year across the city. So that's going to be a huge help for us, and we're trying to reach out to people, people that, you know, live next to empty properties, and some of them cause them nuisance and things like that. So that's one of the mechanisms. But we're also trying to work with private landlords as well to see how do we make it easier for them and how do we support them in order to do that as well. So recently I was at the Housing Festival over in Lyon, and we saw a number of ideas actually of how we can encourage people to bring properties back into use. Because we know a lot of people, you know, they will inherit a property and end up leaving it there for some time, and it's how do we work around that. I know there's also questions around empty buildings, which always makes me feel a little bit nervous when we're talking about things like that, but in terms of the council, we are making a commitment around homelessness, which means economic development also have to commit to helping us on this particular agenda. So in terms of, we know that we're doing the house building, and the council's the biggest house builder, social house builder in the region, but we still know that we need a lot more to come. So we want to work with our partners, whether it's the housing associations, whether it's people who own properties, but also doing a lot of work, again, like I said, around the private rented sector, so that we can encourage a good standard across the city. And I hope that answers your question.
Could I just add something, just to add to Councillor Thompson's point as well? I think part of it is Birmingham's got a commitment to have 30% of all new housing as affordable housing. We need a much clearer definition of that 30%, and making sure that a decent percentage of that is social rented, and a real big challenge out to housing associations to meet some of that unmet need as well. It's absolutely critical, because in the old days, a few years ago, you'd be called a grant junkie for asking for additional grant to build social homes. We're now in a situation where actually we've got a very expensive system with what we're doing, and actually having a bit more money to build a bit more bricks and mortar with lower rents is the best way of making people economically sustainable, which is one of the clearest routes out of homelessness. So that's a real key challenge, and one we're talking to planning colleagues and all the strategic work that's going into the sustainable housing supply discussions that are taking place within the city as well.
Great, thank you. One more question. Yes, and we'll just take this one. Yeah.
Hey, it's just a quick question. Vanessa, I work in commissioning with public health funds. Just building on all the really good stuff in terms of the partnerships, obviously, that are forging to tackle homelessness and the root causes of homelessness. Just a quick thought maybe from the panel about, I'm sure everybody in the room here obviously is in sectors that know that the vulnerability doesn't stop once the issue of rooflessness, homelessness, street sleeping is addressed. And I would just like to know, so that we can work collectively on life after homelessness, and actually how we bring those partnerships together. Have we started to do it? Have we got intentions to do it in terms of using all of the fantastic resource Birmingham's got around neighbourhood networks and everything, to actually build the stories and promote the stories of there is life after homelessness, and people can have productive, fulfilled lives. And we've seen people in the fantastic film today who are examples of that, but just really making sure that that is bolted on, as you know, it makes the circle really, in terms of what are we doing, because there is life and there's positive life after homelessness. And I think that's just the message. You know, I'd like to see all of the collective partners giving us a bit more about what we are doing or can
Brilliant,
do.
brilliant. If we could have planted a question, that would have been it. Thank you. And it wasn't planted. Can we literally do 30 seconds each on that, right across the panel? Because I think, you know, life after homelessness is, of course there is. And actually we want homelessness to be in the dim and distant past of someone's life. And I mean, certainly in the organisation I'm fortunate to run, you know, we work with 7,000 people each year who are either at risk of homelessness or who are homeless. And in our 50 years history, we've never met the person who can't move on beyond homelessness with the right support. So great question. So 30 seconds each across the panel, and then we'll ask Sharon to talk about the second year of the strategy and to close our event.
Okay, shall I go first? Okay, so yeah, life after homelessness. I think you're right. It is something that we don't often celebrate that much. You know, we've heard a lot about of the stories about people and what brought them to become homeless, the factors that contributed to that. We've heard about the homelessness prevention strategy and the domestic abuse strategy and what we're doing to address those issues. But I think probably as a homeless partnership board, as we move forward, it would be good to hear those stories from those experts by experience, from the people that have, you know, gone through their journey, almost to be an inspiration to others who potentially are going through similar circumstances. And I think it's really important that we do hear those stories, and we do show that there is sort of, you know, a light at the end of that tunnel.
Great. Pass the baton.
Thank you. Well, life after homelessness, I think from a primary care perspective, at the Health Exchange we sort of hold on to people for a little while until they're ready to move on, and I think it's about GP provision is so personal, and lots of people don't want to leave the Health Exchange even when they've moved into permanent accommodation. So we have a policy where we do hold on to people for a little while until they're settled, until they're ready to move on, until they feel happy that they can go into another GP practice and register, and we help them do that. I think in mental health terms, if we admit people who are homeless, we will always look for alternative accommodation before we discharge. That is really difficult given the pressure on mental health beds in this city. But we have respite facilities, we have a number of community teams that work across the whole of Birmingham that link in with other sectors. So we have pods in Birmingham of substance misuse services, local sectors that we can link into for mental health and indeed for GP provision.
I think there's so much more we can do, and I think it is a really important point. We don't track success very well, do we, and the journeys that we're all on. And the other thing I'd point out is that we don't do more to put our own organisations out of business, which has to be our primary aim, surely. We did an exercise recently looking at our own operations as part of our business planning, and 70% of our work is crisis and 30% is around prevention. That's no way good enough for an organisation such as ourselves. So we have to transform the way we work to acknowledge all of the things that you've just said and be working. I think the terminology is upstream and preventative and all of those things. Yes, and also do more to people that don't have a voice, because it's not economically expedient to support those people. There is money in homelessness. There's not money with people with no recourse to public funds or trafficking or modern day slavery. That's where we've got to be putting more of our resources, more of our energy, sharing people's journeys and making sure we're coming out the other side and celebrating that as well. So much more work to be done from our organisations and our integrity around what we're aiming to do as organisations.
I think from our point of view, our focus needs to be twofold. We work very closely with rehabilitative services, and I think our commitment to that will continue. I believe it will continue, and I believe that that's really important. I think from that point of view, from a police perspective, life after homelessness is making sure that we don't pull the plug on that level of support that we've given at the front line, but we keep it going and we keep the momentum up. And that's about understanding our communities and understanding the social capital that lives within them. With great focus on social capital and working with those communities also comes the opportunity to work with people with lived experience of homelessness. And I don't think we can, as an organisation, progress and develop and become better at dealing with it without listening to those people with lived experience, and that's where our commitment comes to continuing to work with people after homelessness.
I think I'm going to go back to something I said in one of my presentations, which was around recovery and resilience. Because if there is to be life after homelessness, we've got to prevent repeat presentations of homelessness, and the only way we can do that is by working in a resilience way. The only way we can do that is continuing to invest upstream in prevention activity, and also holding dear to the fact that this is very much about citizens within communities. At some point you've got to take that label off and they become citizens within communities. So then it's very much about how do you connect individuals to activities which enable them to live fulfilling lives within communities, so they don't feel isolated, so they don't feel the need to go back into some form of communal settings which gives them something that they're not getting in terms of their localities.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the questions. Thank you to a great panel.